You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Hi, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a podcast series brought to you by the Conference Board that highlights new books through conversations with their authors. Today, we're discussing Introduction to HR Technologies, Understand How to Use Technology to Improve Performance and Processes with Stacey Harris. Stacey is the Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group and has many roles in addition to that of author. She's an analyst, a writer, a speaker, and a podcast host. So that we've flipped it today, and she's going to be presenting on this podcast. But I've actually been friends with Stacey since I met her at a conference back in 2013. She and I both got our start as research analysts at Burson, but unfortunately we didn't overlap while we were there. But I really do wish this book had been around in 2013 when I became a research analyst, as I came from a non-technical background as a talent management consultant, and the steepest learning curve that I had at that time was around technology. So, Stacey, thanks so much for joining us today to discuss your new book.
Thanks for having me, Robin. I'm really excited to be here. Good chance to talk with you again. And yes, we did overlap in companies, but not in the time frame. But I do feel like, we're sisters in the analyst world, right? That's how it works.
Exactly. No, and friends. So
Yes.
I do appreciate that. So my first question for you is, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, that was it's sort of a long story, right? So I wanted to be an author since I was a young girl. Like many other, I think, girls at my age, that point in time, was enthralled with Little Women and wanted to be Jo and wanted to go out and become a journalist and a writer at an early age. And, I think in all stages you grow up and you find out that there's other ways that you have to sort of figure out how to grow your career. And so I went into doing technical writing and then eventually went into analyst roles where I was writing about technology. And about 2.5 years ago now, almost 3 now, Kogan Publishing came to me through a friend who had recommended me. And they said, look, we're looking to write sort of a basic book about the HR technology industry. Would you be interested? And I said, well, I write a lot. I do a lot of white papers and industry studies and stuff, but I've never thought about writing a full book. And they said, we think you'd be really good at it. And I said, well, to me, the most important thing that we need in the market isn't just another book about where the market's heading from a future perspective and just another sort of what HR technology is book. We need an understanding of how HR technology fits into the HR space. And I said, so as long as I can write what I would consider a primer, the book I would have needed when I was starting out, similar to what you were just talking about, Robin, to help me understand the history of HR technology, how it fits into the HR market, and what we think is the future of HR technology as part of the HR conversation. I said, then I'd be very interested in it. And they were excited about it. They gave me a great editor and a coach. It took me a full 2 years, including a 1.5 years of COVID during that time frame to get it done. But it was definitely a project of passion for me.
Well, it's a great book, and I highly recommend it. But I also wanted to ask you then, so clearly this book would be of interest to HR practitioners, but why would it be helpful for, CEOs in the C-suite?
I actually think this book would be of value to anybody at an executive level or even anyone who is, working in the business space but has to interact with data that's coming from the HR community. So part of the reason is because what we do in this book is we don't just talk about, sort of HR technology as a technology. We talk about it in terms of the outcomes it's trying to achieve for the organization. And a lot of people have bought this book and given it out to their executives in various organizations. And I've gotten feedback that, particularly from an executive's point of view, what this book does best is it breaks down the information around HR technology into a more consumable, sort of overarching picture. And it provides a very clear connection between what an organization is trying to achieve and the HR technology that is tied to those achievements. It was important for me to start every chapter with a story that was a human story. What was my experience with the HR world and the processes and the technology that made an impact on me as an employee or me as a manager or me even as an executive in my own company? So that's where a lot of it came from.
So, and that's actually connects with my next question for you, which was because in the preface you say that human resources is the means by which work and our personal lives connect. So, explain that for our audience. It sounds a little bit like what you were just talking about.
Very much so. Yeah. I mean, growing up, I had a family, and particularly my dad, who was very passionate about education and about developing everyone around him. And I was very lucky to sort of be in an environment where it was just naturally sort of important in my family to ask questions. You would never take anything at face value. And I think one of the things that, I really did when I was working on this book, but I do as an analyst as well, is I want to understand how you can take the technology that I think, we make decisions about, what's the process we want to put in place and how is it going to replace a paper-based process, or how is it going to, make my approach to doing the performance management easier, or how is it going to allow me to maybe get time and attendance process optimized, and then flip it on its head and say, okay, it's not just about the process, but what is it I'm really trying to achieve? And when you think of it in those terms, then what you're finding is that it is that you're trying to achieve two things: a business outcome and a human outcome. And oftentimes we only think about the business outcome. We oftentimes don't think about the human outcome when it comes to an employee. And I really wanted to make sure this book looked at both sides of that picture, because every interaction we have on the business side impacts a human being as an employee, and the decisions they're making and the world they're living in every day too.
I couldn't agree more, Stacey. I did my PhD dissertation on the topic of retention, engagement and retention, and have found in the last 20 years that people don't care about retention unless they're having a hard time with voluntary turnover.
Yes. Exactly.
So, yes, I completely understand that. Yeah, I can see what you mean about how everything has both a business outcome and a personal outcome, even if it's just retaining employees.
Exactly.
Which in today's labor market, you can't just say just retaining employees. So, but anyway, very interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found fascinating was that you go through the history of HR technology since the 1980s, which, was back when HR was most often called personnel and reported to either the finance director or the operations director. So why do you think it's so important that we understand the history?
This was a little bit of a personal thing. When I first started writing the book, I think Kogan was like, "Why are you putting all these dates in here? What's all this? Why do you have to have all these companies' names?" And I said, "No, you just don't understand." I walked into a company that was using my first sort of foray into the HR market. Right, was when I was coming out of my master's program, going into a large banking organization, and I can remember I was so excited to be using the newest technology because I was just coming out of college and there was all this exciting technology we're talking about. And I can remember the conversation with my executive, who basically said, "We just spent $2 million putting in Lotus Notes. No one is going to change that out for this new emerging technology you're talking about." And not only did I feel a little bit like an idiot kind of trying to push all this new technology and not understanding the history of the company that I had walked into, but I also didn't understand the connections that that technology had to other things that were going on in our organization from a business perspective, right? And so I'm very adamant in the book that every person should get to know the technology that they have inside their organization and the history of that technology. I can remember also when I started doing research analyst work, I came from most of the organizations I had been at were using SAP environments, or were using Lotus Notes environments or other things like that. And I came into a world that was highly dominated by this company called PeopleSoft. And it was just after the acquisition by Oracle. And everyone was talking about all this PeopleSoft. And I had no clue who PeopleSoft was. And I was afraid to ask, right? Because I was supposed to know about all this. And so, for me, it really was the writing of the book was a little bit of taking some of the angst that I felt when I first went into several jobs and saying, okay, if I had had this book, maybe it wouldn't have been quite so scary to ask someone about it, right? So, yeah.
Definitely. I had the same experience when people started throwing around words like ATS and CRM, and I didn't know what they meant. So yes, I get that. So one of the chapters in one of the first chapters in the book talks about who owns HR technology, but you also tell us why we should care. So I think our listeners might enjoy hearing those as well.
Yeah. So every chapter of the book is because I'm a person of patterns and categories, right? So of course I had to pattern out my book as well. Every chapter, everything has like a definition, a little bit about the history, and then a why should you care, and then a sort of what's important, where's it heading. And I think the why, in all cases, the why you should care is important in the context of just knowing that sometimes you may not realize how something impacts other things inside your work environment, right? And who owns the HR technologies? There's a really big conversation. There's that difference between someone who has the budget, who owns it from that perspective, to someone who administers it, to someone who is using that data to make business decisions. And I walk through all the different categories of people, along with the end users who have to use it on a daily basis. And the users and the owners are oftentimes sort of interchangeable in some organizations, but I really separate them out and say you've got to look at ownership in the sense of HR, in that we have a responsibility to achieve an outcome for the business. And if we don't understand what our technology can do, and we don't take some ownership of what that technology does inside our organization, we are basically giving away not only the power that we have as HR, but also we're relegating to an IT professional or to a technical role the most important thing that we can do for our organization, which is elevate important data to make decisions.
We should definitely care about those important decisions. So definitely think that's important.
Yeah.
In one of the chapters, you differentiate between a highly connected HR technology environment versus one that is more simplistic. So I thought that might be an interesting conversation for you to have with our listeners, just to tell them about those differences.
Yeah, I think, there is a tendency in every technology market, right, to want to simplify, to want to say, I'm just going to have one vendor. Oftentimes we hear in the analyst world that people want one throat to choke, which is not a really good way of looking at it. But it is this idea that, having too many different vendors creates oftentimes this environment where, they're all just sort of fighting among each other. And I don't have the ability to really make them work cohesively. And I think there was this idea that maybe we could do that, whether that was in HR or enterprise applications. And I think we have realized in the last probably 5 years, the market needs to move too quickly. We need to be able to adapt more quickly than any one enterprise application can do. So the idea that I'm going to have a single platform that meets all my needs is probably unrealistic. But we sometimes try and we don't spend enough time, I think, oftentimes understanding that we are not just buying a bunch of different applications and just sort of slotting them into pegs. We are creating an ecosystem, whether that's HR or enterprise applications. And that ecosystem is not just about the applications themselves, but the data flows between them, where the budgets are coming from, the end user sort of experiences of each one of, right? And so when I'm really sort of making the case for how you should manage a complex HR technology environment, I'm making the case that you should treat it like a living, breathing ecosystem, like your own, sort of. I think I have an example in there of a community that you're building, right? There are some places where there's core important buildings, there's roadways, and there's standards you have to put in place across all of it. And then there's also a really important understanding that no community, no ecosystem stays the same. This idea that we're going to try and hold back, or once we implement this, we're all done, is also another, I think, a myth we've sold ourselves. We should be expecting that something is changing every year, and that there's always some sort of dramatic opportunity to sort of improve in those ecosystems on a regular basis. So that's kind of the way I look at it, from a difference between sort of thinking about this sort of once and done or simple systems that I've just slotted into something versus creating an ecosystem.
I like that. It's a great way to define it. So.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the chapter. I didn't expect to, but I really enjoyed the chapter on core HR administration applications because I knew nothing about benefit systems. So I thought that was a very interesting chapter. But I was very interested with your talking about payroll systems and how they have to be flawless, and then all of the data that's actually available. So I thought our listeners might find that interesting as well.
Yeah, I've often told companies, I think, there's always levels of sort of excitement about certain technologies and certain functions in the HR department, right? Like there's this really great excitement about talent management and cool engagement platforms and all this really neat stuff, and learning and surveying tools and recruiting tools. But I think the most often overlooked and oftentimes the deepest wealth of information can be found in our payroll applications. And the people in the organization who administer your payroll applications oftentimes get very little credit for what they really know about the organization. I give some great examples in the book about how I had the opportunity to work with a payroll function and realize that they were able to, unlike in a talent management environment where the talent professionals only saw issues once there was a problem because people weren't entering data or because they weren't getting enough recruits into a system. The payroll professionals could tell you without a doubt who were the problem managers inside of an organization before anybody else, because they saw the exceptions to time offs or the issues with overtime or the challenges with clocking in and clocking out, because they oftentimes manage the time and attendance areas as well. They saw the early indicators of many times of the trouble areas within organizations, or they would see a zone that was ramping up rapidly, that no one else was paying attention to. And so the payroll data does have to be flawless, and those professionals have to make sure that, because every day people are feeding their families and paying their bills with those paychecks, but because it has to be flawless, they are seeing data at a much more rapid rate and a much more, I said, deeper sort of understanding, if you're willing to take a look at it, about what's really happening in the organization. And so I think it's an underrated and undervalued area of the organization for real true analysis and analytics for an organization.
So is that a plug for human capital analytics? If an organization isn't looking at that yet, it's definitely something to
Yeah.
start thinking about if you haven't yet. And if you haven't yet started looking at that data that's coming out of your payroll system.
Yes, human capital analytics don't just start with I think oftentimes human capital analytics gets started with survey or engagement data, right? Like and I think that's real easy to sort of then discount later on, because it's the opinions of our employees, and depending on where we're at as far as our relationship with our employees, we often are willing to either take or not take that opinion and make some changes to our organization. But when it comes down to payroll data, if you start your human capital analytics function based off of that kind of hardcore information, I often tell people some of your best human capital management professionals might actually come out of your payroll environment. They may not be coming from some of the other strategic areas, because they have a broader view of what's happening in the organization. So as you're thinking about maybe automating some things in payroll, think about, is there anybody in that function who has a broader view and could be moved into analytics and developed? And you start analyzing that kind of data, you have a much more actionable outcomes. And I think that becomes a much more valuable analytics function within the organization. But yes, I am a big proponent that if you don't have some function analyzing the data going on in your HR, it's really hard to make a change. I just over the weekend had watched. I don't know if you know how many people. I'm late to the game. Let's put it that way on watching, but I watched the movie This Changes Everything. It was a 2019 documentary done about the media industry, and Gina Davis, who is a star in the industry, had been trying to explain that there wasn't enough female directors in the industry. There just wasn't, and everybody kept telling her, "Well, no, we've made some progress, and we've got people in the industry." And she said, "There's not enough female representation in children's stories or other things." And I said, "Yeah, no, we do." She commissioned a study, and they found out after she did the study that only 16% of all of the children's stories and directors in the industry were female, and no one could believe how low it was. And I think that's the thing that people really need to understand about data, is that sometimes we don't like what we're going to see, but it is the facts, right?
Well, and it also creates a great foundation for changes then that need to get made, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
So the area of HR technology that I've studied the most over the past 8.5 years is talent acquisition technology. And one of the things that shocked me early on was that most mid to large size organizations have anywhere from 15 to 25 different talent acquisition technologies that all need to be connected through APIs. And that sounds very technical, I know, but an API is an application programming interface, which if you've got that many different technologies, they need to talk to each other, right? So my question for you is do you find that consulting clients for TA technologies is difficult because there's so many components and, there's so many vendors? I just was curious about how that was working out.
Yeah. Well, TA and talent acquisition and recruiting and onboarding and all the things that go into talent acquisition, right? I think right now is hot. Everybody's talking about it. It's interesting. I do a bit of, sort of surveying of the market, and I can tell sort of recruiting is top of mind for small organizations, but also for large organizations. But the challenge, I think, is that it's still very siloed to the type of workforce. So there is a lot of very specific talent acquisition that we see if you're hiring, blue collar workforce, if you're hiring a workforce that has high turnover level, if you're hiring a workforce that is requiring specific technical skills or specific scientific skills. And I think sometimes what we're seeing in the market is that organizations are finding better ways to more quickly get through the idea of identifying the skill sets or the requirements that we want from the employee or from the candidate. What we're not doing a really good job of in the market is doing a better job understanding that the jobs themselves are kind of changing on a daily basis. And so we're not doing a really good job sort of bringing out what the jobs really are and understanding how the change in those jobs and the changes in our organizations will impact the kind of candidates we need in our organizations. So we have lots of technologies that are focused on finding the right candidate. And oftentimes we're finding the right candidate for the wrong job, right?
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. And so we're I think what we really need to think about isn't just the number of technologies and how they're all sort of disparately working together. We need to maybe rethink the idea of what talent acquisition is doing inside of our organizations, and that they really need to be doing a much better job of understanding the idea of a fluid job role, which is what the market is coming out with, right? And how do I manage to a fluid job role? And how do I think about it as an internal and an external conversation and adjust cultural elements that will allow me to do internal mobility and external mobility, and think about, placing people in places that I'll bring them back over time, creating a much more cohesive model versus just, I have a need, I need to fill it within this amount of time, and I need to then, move on to the next job requisition. So and I don't know if that's an answer you were looking for, Robin. It's a little bit more complex, but I think anybody who's in this space right now, if all you're doing is trying to find a candidate faster, you're probably not going to actually get the outcomes you're looking for.
Yeah, we actually just published a report where one of the organizations that we interviewed said that hiring managers are looking for people right now who can fill a position, but that the recruiters were looking for the future, right? They're looking for people who could fit in the long term and that have, that idea of potential, right? So I think that that's what you're getting at when you're talking about a more fluid job role. I mean, I completely agree with it. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how that translates into all the different technologies. But one of the technologies that I've heard a lot about recently gets at what you were talking about internal mobility. And that is around talent marketplaces, or those platforms that allow everyone in the organization, managers, to all the employees, to post opportunities for open positions, short-term assignments, but also mentorships and learning that's required to get from point A to point B. And in our study, we found that we did a study of 180 HR leaders, and only 39% of their organizations said that they had a talent marketplace. So is that something that you think that we'll be seeing more frequently in the future?
Yes and no. So I think I'm not surprised by the data point that you've got, and I've seen similar data points that show even fewer percentages for those who actually have like a process for internal mobility, right? I think what we're seeing in the market, what I'm and my book talks a little bit about this, because it does start to talk about the fact that when you think about technology, so talent acquisition is a great example of, oftentimes we only see it for the candidate, right? But some of the most exciting COVID conversations were people who took external talent acquisition tools and flipped them around basically, and were using them for internal mobility in the height of the COVID-19 crisis, because they were able to find the skill sets internally to sort of shift people around the organization. There's a great sort of Delta case study around that, and a couple others. What I think is the challenge is that there's a lot of technology out there right now that can do this. It is not a technology gap issue. And I mention this a lot in the book towards the back end of it, is that technology enables, but technology does not address the real issues inside organizations, which are cultural changes that have to take place. And what we find is that the number one reason organizations are not sort of taking advantage of what is pretty rapidly increasing amount of what we would call talent marketplaces tools, and all of the vendors are offering something like this right now, is because internally they don't have a process for understanding skills that are necessary for those talent marketplaces, and or they don't have a culture that supports that kind of movement inside the organization. So for example, a manager might not want to let go of their best worker because yes, they know it's an opportunity for them to move forward, but now they've got double duty work and nobody helping them fill their position, and they're still held accountable to the same outcomes that they were being, goals and KPIs, and nobody's really sort of helping them if they let their best employees move on, right? And we see this being addressed by, like, some managers, some organizations putting in place, opportunities where they're going to give bonuses to managers who move people up, or there's some things where they're going to help, they try and create an environment where people can take small projects like you had mentioned, so they can sort of do their current job and do other things. But I think fundamentally we have to realize that movement in an organization does cause change, and change causes some slowdown in things. And I think that's part of what the market has to get through is that kind of a conversation, would be my sense.
Oh, I definitely agree. And in fact, in our report, we talk about the importance of a culture that supports internal talent mobility, because without it being culturally accepted, you're exactly right. There's so many leaders who want to hoard their talent.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like to say to leaders when I'm talking to them is, how many of your most talented employees actually want to wait for their boss to die? Because is that what you're expecting them to do?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyway, just a little bit of humor there. I've got one last question for you, Stacey, and it's not a small one, but that's okay. What's your vision for artificial intelligence and human resources? 2 parts though. Do you think the future of work is all AI all the time? And then, do we really want the robots to be the ones managing HR? So unpack as you will.
Wow. Okay. Where do I go with that? Well, I do talk a little bit about this in the book. So the last couple chapters in the book are about sort of where I do see the future of work going and how to think a little bit about artificial intelligence. So I'll add a couple of comments there. First off, I think that if you're going to bury your head in the sand and say, well, I don't like artificial intelligence, or it's not right, that's not the answer. The future is automation and automated learning and some level of sort of machine learning in all of the worlds that we're working in. What I do think we have to do, though, which is really important, is that we need to start to educate our professionals on the difference between a machine's answer to something and a human's answer to something. Because most of our systems up to this point have been programmed with a human's response. Basically, you would put a list of ways that a machine should to look at something. They would pick the one that was closest, and then you would get a response that was basically created by a human, but it was just, automated by a machine. In machine learning, we are getting a response that is curated by a machine, which means that a machine without all the context is deciding that because it's an 80% probability that someone might sort of leave your organization, they are a risk of flight. And I think human beings, particularly in the HR profession, have to realize that now, instead of looking for one piece of data point, we have to look at ratios, and how you read ratios is different than a yes or no answer. And that's a big shift in changing our whole management architecture across the world, to understand that you are now reading ratios and you're not reading a yes or no answer about something. And when you read a ratio, you have to take into context that there is 20% who will say, I'm not going to be a flight. There's a reason why I'm not going to be a flight. Human beings are not as predictable as we would like them to be. And so that kind of thinking, I think, is something that we really have to build into the process. The other thing I would say about where the future of HR is at with this is that if HR thinks that, it is better user design is more screens or faster screens or prettier colors or whatever it might be, right? The real answer is that, we don't want to see our technology. That's the future of technology. We don't want to know it's there. We don't want to have to think about it. We don't have to reprogram it. which means that what you really have to be looking at is probably, if you're looking at where the future is going to be at, is much more along the lines of Internet of Things, things that are happening in manufacturing environments, things that are happening in your marketing environments, where it picks up on what's going on in the environment and the data you're inputting all the time throughout your life. Instead of re-asking you to fill information out or re-asking you to go into a screen or having you do this. And with that, when you get an answer, again, you have to be able to understand that, okay, the machine picked up all this environmental information about me or what I want or what I might like. How do I then calibrate it so that it works the way I want it to? So it's much more teaching people how to calibrate their future systems, right? But that's hard, I think, for the market to understand. It's probably someone just gave me this really great quote. I thought it was a really good commentary that things are going to change slower in the next 12 to 24 months than we think, but faster in the next 5 years than we think. And I think that it was owned by someone who's in the industry, in the tech space. But I do think it's quite true in this particular case. We are going to get there in the next 5 years much faster than we think, but it won't happen in the next 12 to 24 months. It's just going to start to happen gradually, and all of a sudden it'll be here, is my sense of it.
Well, that's very interesting. And I hope that we always are, whether you call it human capital or human resources, I hope we can always keep the human in this field, particularly. I think it's important. So thank you so much for all of your insights, Stacey, and thank you to our listeners for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and have a better understanding of HR technologies. The description for this recording includes a link to Stacey's book. And if you'd like to find out more, please visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or /webcasts for more interactive programs. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again and goodbye.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.